It is the top of the hour. Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Paul with IAAP, and thank you for joining us today for our third session in our higher education webinar series. Before we get started, just a few items to review. The closed captioning is provided today. You can select the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll also post in the chat a third-party link if you prefer. Attendee mics are muted to prevent any background noise or disruptions, and today's webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards to all our participants and registrants today. If you have any questions throughout, please try to leave your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to those, and I'll also be monitoring the chat for any technical issues or general dialogue. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to James to start our program today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. Good day. I'm James Thurston. I'm Vice President with G3ICT. The IAAP is a unit of G3ICT. And I'm joined here today by Chris Misra, who's the Vice Chancellor and CIO at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Chris, do you want to just say a quick hello?
Hi, I'm Chris Misra. As James said, I'm the Vice Chancellor and CIO. I've been here for 20 some odd years at this point.
Fantastic. So our goal with this session is to share with all of you some detail about how the UMass approach to being more accessible, more inclusive through technology, through its technology assets and deployments. And Chris and I, over the next hour, want to surface and share with you, I think, what are some valuable and actionable experiences from UMass that hopefully will apply to your own accessibility journey in your higher education institution. This session, this particular session, is the third in the IAA Higher Ed series. It's also the first of the next 3 sessions, which relate to and are sort of sourced from G3ICT's work with universities and higher education institutions using our Smart University Digital Inclusion Maturity Model tool. And I'm just going to briefly give you a little bit of information on that, just so it'll make a little bit more sense as Chris and I start to have a conversation about our work with Chris and what Chris has been leading and driving there at the University of Massachusetts. If you don't mind putting up the slide of the maturity model, the Smart University Digital Inclusion Maturity Model tool it's an assessment tool and a benchmarking tool. And it's really to help universities better understand how their digital transformation, how they're using technology, how their use of data is either supporting accessibility, inclusion of people with disabilities, or potentially presenting barriers to the inclusion of people with disabilities, including faculty, staff, and students, and even really the broader community that where the university might sit. So the tool itself, the assessment tool, it's made up of 28 variables. We call them enablers, and they define what it really means to be an inclusive smart university. They enable accessibility and enable inclusion. These variables or enablers contribute to the university's building up the capabilities that we know support greater inclusion and accessibility at a university. This slide here, what we are showing is the 18 core capabilities. Those are the white boxes that are listed here, and they're organized into 5 groupings or buckets, or what we call pillars. And these capabilities, and with the tool, we're able to look at the role of things like leadership, the existence of a digital inclusion strategy or not. We look at the accessibility of the university's engagement channels, how it's pushing information out, getting information back. Are those accessible? We look at things like the culture of diversity and is the university employing people with disabilities? Is it training on disability and accessibility? We look at things like procurement. What systems does the university have in place to make sure that its investments in technology and its deployments of technology are accessible? So a whole range of issues that we know are pretty critical to a university becoming increasingly accessible, increasingly inclusive. And of course, we do dig into technology and data, which are the backbone and the lifeblood of a smart university. And the way that we use these variables, these 28 enablers, these 18 capabilities, is in a 3-step process that's pretty straightforward. We do some analysis of documents, IT strategies, digital inclusion strategies, budgets, accessibility statements. We do some analysis of those. We make available to the university an online self-assessment where they sort of rank themselves across these variables. And then we actually do an expert site visit where we curate a team of of global experts on inclusion and accessibility and bring them in to engage with the university, dig into some of these variables, and hopefully at the same time provide some help and assistance on pain points and issues that the university might be experiencing. And then the final step is we deliver a roadmap, which includes a set of scores for each of these variables and a set of priorities and recommendations for moving forward. So if you're at a level 2 on a scale of 1 to 5 for procurement, these are the kinds of things you might think about doing to get to levels 3, 4, and 5. So pretty straightforward. The process with UMass, and we'll be jumping in with Chris in just a minute. We I think started that process last spring and sort of did the site visit, I think in early summer this past year. And in that process, we reviewed probably more than 20 documents, these budgets, these strategies, these org charts, policy statements. We talked with more than 40 UMass faculty and staff over 10 different listening sessions. And then we delivered the roadmap. And in the roadmap, UMass, I think, had real relative strengths in the area of leadership and in other areas identified where there was an opportunity to really make some steps to have some improvements in the capabilities and ultimately in the accessibility and inclusion there. So that's a little bit of a background on how G3ICT came to be working with UMass. I thought it might be useful to sort of frame our conversation. And with that, Yulia, we can drop that slide. And I'm really excited now, and I've been looking forward to this discussion, Chris, for quite a while, of jumping in with you and hearing a little bit about the UMass Amherst journey, where you are, where you're headed. But maybe we can start, if you can tell us a little bit about the University of Massachusetts Amherst and give us a general sense of the university and how you're deploying technology there.
Sure, thanks, James. So UMass Amherst, for those of you who aren't familiar with Massachusetts geography, I grew up in Massachusetts, so I know we're about 90 minutes west of Boston, about 175 miles northeast of New York City. It's a relatively rural area, but it's a significant institution. We have about 24,000 undergraduate students, about 7,500 graduate students, about 1,500 instructional faculty. Largest state institution in New England, Research One, $233 million, $1.3 billion budget, right? Big. 1,500 acre campus, which is the biggest thing, is trying to find your way around the campus. So our journey to accessibility came about really through just conversations and advocacy within the campus in terms of this has to be a key responsibility for us. So our technology platform is really very traditional higher education. We've migrated many of our services to the cloud, excessive use of Zoom recently, Google, Exchange email platforms. And the challenge with a campus of this size is really just managing the breadth and depth of both a campus and a highly decentralized institution.
Great, thanks. And when we started working, we probably started having conversations about a year ago, actually, just as we were coming into the pandemic, and universities in particular, I think we're scrambling to try to figure out, okay, how do we fulfill our mission in this environment? Can you talk a little bit about sort of what that looked like as we were coming into the pandemic, and from a CIO perspective, the kinds of things that you were thinking about and needing to take steps on?
Sure, there were sort of two interesting aspects. I mean, aside from it's amongst the longest days of my career in the past and probably ever going forward, just in terms of how do you migrate an institution of that size to an online education. You know, we made a very early determination. We were one of the earlier schools that decided to go remote. We thought it would be 2 weeks. And so we took a double spring break, but we quickly ramped up our technology portfolio. We were fortunate that we'd already had tools like Zoom. We had pretty good practice of online education, a fairly robust online education school, but not a lot of digitally native capacity to teach instructionally remote. And so there's really two principal areas of impact. There is a principal area of impact in academics and the impact in administration. Since we had extended out the spring break for an extra week, we actually had 2 weeks to figure out how we're going to do these academics. But that meant we had to move the administration into an online world in a very short order of time. From the basic things of how are we going to pick up the mail to how are we going to communicate, how do staff meetings work, and recognizing that institutionally we were a face-to-face campus. Our staff meetings were face-to-face, our one-on-one meetings were face-to-face, and we had to comport all of that. So the social change was actually significant, and that led quickly to substantial change in the academic side as well. We saw increases of astounding increases in Zoom utilization. One of my favorite statistics on Zoom utilization is in the first in the first day of the first week when we brought our academics online, we used more Zoom time the entire month previously. So each day in April, we used the same number of Zoom hours in the entire month of February. And that pace continued through the balance of the spring semester.
Yeah, Chris, I remember that data point as well, and I often use it myself because I think it is a really easy and compelling example of this accelerated digital transformation. Can you talk a little bit about where how accessibility fits into IT and into the university in general? I know you've got a really great IT strategy. Accessibility is embedded in there. I don't think that there's a specific digital inclusion or necessarily accessibility strategy, but maybe a little bit about strategy and organizational structure, just so that we understand how accessibility fits in.
Absolutely. So we've actually been fortunate from an IT perspective. We've had staff supporting accessibility, but a very modest staff. I think when James did the assessment, we had a single staff member. At a high point, we had 2 staff, and we're in the process of transitioning that as well. So our overall accessibility strategy comes multifold. My team is responsible for the information technology, and that's across the board. That means we support students' technology use in the classroom, we support faculty's technology use, we provide general technology use for administration. We do not have responsibility for accessibility accommodations per se. We have a disability services team on campus. It's organized in our student affairs area. So really it's a key partnership working between student affairs, working with my central IT organization. I will say from a maturity perspective, though we had staff, it was very much more about boutique service, solving discrete individual accommodations, and it hadn't crossed the line of being generalizable to most of our day-to-day normal use of population technology. It was very much targeted at a subset population that had self-disclosed a need for an accommodation.
Right, and we'll, I know as part of this conversation, we'll get into a bit later a discussion of these issues of silos and coordination and collaboration, which we had a lot of conversation about when we were working with you. So maybe we can jump in now a little bit into this sort of notion of accelerated accessibility that happened for UMass for sure, but probably for most universities around the world, and because of the pandemic and what that looks like, and how, maybe start with a little bit about how does the university deploy technology assets that are accessible and really are working for everyone, and what did it look like to have this sort of intensified effort to include a focus on accessibility as you were becoming more and more using technology more and more to do all of your services, both administrative and academic and teaching?
Sure. So I'd say the structural change that really occurred was, I think originally we treated accessibility as meeting the needs of identified individuals who had to have accommodations and making sure our web content was accessible, doing basic accessibility reviews, but it was basic WC3G, not a lot of detailed work, and it was not invested across the board in terms of, we had a lot of natively accessible tool set, but it was really natively delivered accessible tool set. There wasn't a lot of work and push for us to drive an institutional priority around making sure our content was natively accessible, except where there was either liability or, like I said, dedicated accommodation. As we went into the pandemic, that really had to pivot because we realized we no longer had the mechanism. We couldn't deploy a note taker for a student in a classroom because there wasn't a classroom. We couldn't make point-by-point accommodations on either a technology or a use case basis. And so we had to start generalizing. We were fortunate that we're in the midst of a transition of our strategic plan. So we're actually at a point of making that type of pivot of identifying digital inclusion as a core property going forward. And so we had a lot of the substrate work, but I'd say the pandemic really drove us to recognize it wasn't solely about a compliance obligation, but much more about reaching our community where they're at.
And as you were making that shift, were you, some of what we had talked about in the past, as when you're in the middle of all this, is there some much like what you would probably do on the security side of your work, any sort of risk rating system and trying to make these decisions about where are we going to prioritize and focus first in those types of decisions when it comes
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that for me I consider fortunate is, prior to my role as a CIO, I've been in a number of roles at UMass. I came from a very technical background. But I spent many years in a security role. So I was responsible for information security at the organization. Within the information security field, it's very much a derivative risk management field. It works very heavily on risk, and concepts like maturity models play very heavily there. So when you're assessing, implementation of controls to mediate security risk, you have to assess what is the cost of the control, what is the value, what is the return, and the easiest way to assess that is against a maturity model. So I had a lot of familiarity with the concept of maturity models. One of the things that made me very excited about the engagement of G3 ICT was the application of this discipline type technology of applying a maturity model to a domain like accessibility, because I had not seen that done before, but I'd had a lot of experience. What's nice about that is it gives you an abstract way of measuring your progress. Although there can be a metric and a rating, it also talks about where you are legitimately relative to your peers, but what steps you can take, and gives you a better mechanism to start prioritizing resource allocation. So as I moved out of information security into a CIO role, I changed from being responsible for compliance to be responsible for budget, priority, and allocation. And so being able to have a document like a maturity model that can help guide investment and show return relative to cost was a better framework for us to make ongoing decision making. And I felt more at home in that security field, like, oh, we know this is a high risk, let's apply a resource here. Even if the resource is fairly modest, it's going to get a significant return against that issue.
Yeah, can you, if you're able, can you talk a little bit about some of those areas where you were making decisions at the time in this accelerated period of focus on accessibility, as in addition to a lot of other things, where you are identifying risk and taking some steps specifically around improving the accessibility of your technology assets?
Sure. And in some cases, what's interesting with the technology assets is our first pass, because we're technologists, is let's just fix the technology. But what we really came down to is in many cases, it's about the business process as well. So when we started going through this assessment process, we realized the first and foremost, with 24,000 student population moving remote, we had to get in front of the faculty and the instructors to explain why this was relevant. So it wasn't so much about, hey, don't put a poorly scanned PDF up on your website. We'd already been providing those types of instructions, but it really had to pivot to, is your course content accessible natively? And in that case, it is still digital accessibility, but it may be, have you applied alt tags to your PowerPoints? Have you made sure you're not doing sort of poorly rendered PDFs? Is your content screen readerable? It was these sorts of things that actually are technology related, but it was about the business process behind it. So what we did is we formed a working group between my team, our university library, our Center for Teaching and Learning, and our instructional designers, who we call our ideas group. It's a big long acronym I can never remember, but we put those together as ideas is the support resource that faculty primary interact with. Library is a resource that provides a lot of these supplementary external materials. IT is a lot of times the bridging infrastructure. So it was really about forming a coalition within campus, identifying priorities that was helped informed by the maturity model where those risk areas are, and providing guidance, which wasn't just apply technology, but help individuals creating content to make the content accessible natively. Because the incremental cost to them was much smaller than us throwing lots of money at making the technology do it for them.
So you touch on a really important point that I think would resonate with any university around the world, which is the sort of decentralized structure of universities, and we'll dig into that more deeply in a minute. But I'm just wondering, as you were partnering in leading this accelerated digital transformation during the pandemic, and a focus on accessibility as part of that, how was that received? I recall in part of our conversations, for example, there was with the faculty, there may have been some incentives around going digital, and maybe even going digital and accessible at the same time. But in general, how would you say this accelerated accessibility was received?
So I would say it was received well. I was actually somewhat surprised at how well it was received. Those of you who've been at universities, especially in large universities with their very decentralized power structures, recognize that change comes slowly. The ship turns slowly, as we like to say, right? It'll get there eventually, but it turns slowly. I was tremendously impressed with the empathy and the caring shown by the faculty and the instructors involved in supporting students at a distance, that they recognized an individual obligation. And really our role as technologists was to reduce that barrier to them to make their content accessible. So there was some financial structure incentives as we went into our subsequent semester that helped faculty teaching online to build hybrid instruction. And what we did is we developed a series of standards to make sure as our content went out, it met these standards. That was sort of the condition of the incentivizing. So rather than make it a big deal like, hey, you all have to do it accessible, it was really embedded into an existing incentivization structure, but we added the accessibility obligations as additional compliance checks to go to a accessible by default role. I was concerned about the uptake we'd see from faculty, but I was very surprised. The other thing with decentralized higher education, as much as the ship turns slowly, once everybody gets where you're going, they generally get on board. And so we took this more adapt to the culture of the campus, adapt to the change culture of the campus, and tie into those change mechanisms that are effective. That's what really helped us be more successful, I believe. That and the empathy of the faculty and the instructors.
Great, thanks. So in maybe taking a little bit of a step back, but still thinking about the deployment of accessible, inclusive technology assets. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking, UMass's thinking and approach to incident management? How do you remediate issues? How does that happen? And then the other piece that I'd love to hear a little bit more is about testing when it comes to accessibility, automated user testing.
Sure. So sort of twofold. On the testing piece, we have employed students both in our help desk and our accessibility office to do some of the testing. We actually are just launching another program to do more broad usability testing, which includes accessibility testing, working in concert with some faculty in our writing program. They tend to have a good degree of expertise in there. So the other advantage of a higher education institution is students are fresh, motivated, focused, and quite inexpensive labor. And they like the work. It's great experience. It's great value to them. It's great value to us institutionally. So we've really tied into that. This is something we've done for many, many years. Tie into a workforce that's motivated, it's interesting. We've definitely seen the awareness of our student body around accessibility issues is much greater in the last 5 and 10 years than it has been previously. I've been asked about making sure content is accessible from a course perspective. It's just that there's been a shift, and the challenge is that shift isn't necessarily as strongly perceived at the faculty that are instructing them because they tend to be a little bit older. So using the students to help motivate that work has really helped improve the accessibility piece of it, because we've embedded the testing more into the core processes when we roll out new applications, whether it's a PeopleSoft application or a new web application. We're commissioning that testing as part of launches of applications as well as new web properties.
Hey, Chris, Mark Nichols is asking a question about if the standards that you're talking about before content goes out, or even other standards that you're looking at in testing on related to accessibility, are they in-house standards, or are you using global standards like WCAG? And
they are in-house standards developed off WCAG. I can find the link in a minute, but I'll try not to be too inappropriate and start typing while I'm on my laptop. But I will get James and Yulia a link afterwards. We posted up our academic standards and it referred to those suggestions. It was built off of WCAG. One thing just amongst everybody here, accessibility is not my first language. I'm an InfoSec guy. I was a technologist. I was a Linux sysadmin. So I know the acronyms, I know the space, but it's not quite my domain of expertise. I'm fortunate to have well-trained staff who understand this both on my team and in the disability services team. So we can absolutely share those standards. They were academic standards we posted for the fall semester for 2020.
Thank you, Mark, Chris. And yeah, we will figure out with Rachel, I guess, how we can share some of this information through IAAP, which we absolutely want to do. So, Chris, I know, as I recall from our previous conversations and work, there were sort of 9 legacy platforms that you guys had deployed. And I'm wondering if over the course of the many months since we've worked together, how you're thinking about incident management has changed or evolved, or how you're approaching that and dealing, how much of an issue incident accessibility issues have become in this accelerated period?
I mean, the challenge has been, I had, before, I believe we started talking about the accessibility review before the pandemic. I had high hopes that we would be able to make significant progress on some of our core administrative systems in the shorter term. And then the pandemic hit, and next thing I knew, we were running COVID testing sites for the western part of the state. We were running vaccination programs. We were one of the earliest vaccination programs for first responders. So unfortunately, a lot of the resources I'd have to help make accessibility improvements to our core applications really got put aside for new application deployment. What I will say is we've been strong about implementing accessibility standards for those new applications as we roll them out. So at this point, my hope is to get us back, likely as we refactor some of our applications, to do a more detailed review. It's definitely a goal. It's an asserted goal. It's part of our roadmap and our strategy going forward. It's just with the pandemic, the resource allocation tipped everything so sideways. I'm a little further behind than I'd hoped to be there. So the legacy platforms, we haven't made as much progress as I was hoping to. We've certainly made progress. What we've made significant progress in is the awareness and the accountability that accessibility is an issue that has to be accommodated at deployment or at refresh of an application. And that was a huge improvement that we hadn't been able to make it successfully in the past.
Yeah, you've shared with, at least with me, what I think are some really interesting facts about how USC CIO had to evolve into using technology to support a dramatically increased public health role of the university for the state during the pandemic, which is pretty amazing. There's another question from Peter: who decides the threshold for compliance? It's never 100%.
And so it's, again, this is where I'm going to go a little bit on my information security soapbox, right? The definition of compliance is just bending the will to another. So yeah, it's never 100%. It's not going to be 100%. Really what we do is we use a risk-based model, understanding where the risk is. So usually that started historically with either liability to the institution or legal accommodation requirements. And that's a barrier to cross, that's a legal obligation to cross, but it's really not meeting this notion of digital inclusion as a core value of the campus. So the threshold is really handled generally on a case-by-case basis. There isn't an arbitrary threshold. What we focus on is these are the recommendations to make your course content accessible, to make your web property accessible, and these are the standards. So from a web property perspective, we do actually have a compliance checklist. So we actually have a team inside our university relations group that will run through both automated testing and some hand-based testing to look at, does the content render in a screen reader? Does it provide appropriate alt image tags and things like that? My goal with compliance is always making sure that we're investing the right amount of resource to ensure that we meet the largest degree of population as effectively as we can. Information security is a risk management game. Accessibility and compliance becomes a risk management game. And it's hard sometimes to think of it in those terms. But one of the challenges I think that I've seen working with some of my staff is staff that come with a tremendous degree of accessibility concern are passionate, profound, and focused. The challenge is also balancing those resources against the other resource needs of campus, right? How much time can I spend on ensuring my web properties are accessible if at the same time I have to take those same resources and allocate them to make sure we're setting up a COVID vaccination clinic? It's really a continuum of resource allocations. So for me, thinking about how can I make sure there's always a guarantee of resource allocation towards accessibility, recognizing that that might not be core to our mission. What can be core to our mission is deploying accessible applications on a go-forward basis, but our core mission is instructing students, performing research, being a land-grant institution. We always have to balance that resource allocation to make sure we're moving the ball forward in these different fronts, but serving first and foremost, what is it we're core here to do? And it's instruct students. Accessibility is a component of that, but it can't be the dominating component. It has to be an absolutely key component, but the dominating is us delivering students with a path to their future.
Fantastic, Chris. But before we go on to the next topic, maybe just briefly, if you can talk about thinking about your staff and the technology staff at the university, even more broadly, perhaps the skilling and training on accessibility and how you think about that and approach that.
Yeah, I think there's three aspects of that. So the first aspect was, we've had some staff transition, our accessibility staff. So it was making sure we have the appropriate professional training for folks that are doing the direct either accommodation work or engagement and consultation work. And that's always been a fairly straightforward. That's just an institutional investment, and that just makes good sense. Where the real value we've seen is both from a leadership perspective, raising accessibility as a topic of concern at senior levels at the institution. So raising this concept, our provost is fluid with the concept of accessibility, right? He's not going to go out and do a WCAG review, but he gets the concept that he can instruct his deans that this is going to have to be a key component of the content their faculty deliver on a go-forward basis. So from a training perspective, there's a lot of fairly low-cost effort that we can put in place to raise accessibility on the radar from a leadership perspective, discuss it with a broad team of not just executive, but operational, manager, and cross-functional teams. We've also been very successful in engaging our students about accessibility conversations. And what does that mean to you? Because my concept of accessibility is how big is the font is. A student's concept of accessibility may be how does it render on a cell phone? That's a very different problem set depending on what technology you apply to that. It doesn't have to be, but we need to collect those voices in terms of understanding what that means. And a lot of that does not involve a lot of out-of-pocket cost.
And just one more question, and then we'll move on to one of my favorite topics, which is sort of collaboration across departments. From Kathy, how do you decide what to test? Do you do spot checks of certain websites, course websites, and more checking of applications used by large populations?
Sure. So let me break up the administrative from the academic side of things. So from the administrative side of things, we actually have a review process for our web properties in conjunction between our IT team and our university relations team that's responsible for our web properties. So there is actually a checkoff evaluative process for our core web properties. I mean, I'm fully confident there is probably some research lab websites or some individual PI websites that were created by WordPress that probably don't meet the tests they need. We focus on the high visibility targets to make sure the information that's most relevant to a large population gets out there. From a course perspective, we do have a couple of very large enrollment courses. We tend to focus most of our resources on ensuring the platform is accessible natively. There's always compliance issues, right? There's always some faculty member that wants to take their PDF from 1982, turn it 10 degrees and scan it and hope it will work. We do spot checks, especially on the large enrollment courses, but generally we focus on ensuring the platforms are natively compliant and then providing strong guidance to the faculty to ensure they have the guidance and parameters of what are those steps that they can take. It's relatively de minimis, relatively incremental burden for them, but provides a more inclusive experience natively.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so now let's shift gears a little bit, Chris, and get into these issues of collaboration, coordination, working across departments at a big university on a big campus. One of the other things that stuck in my mind that you said early on when we started working together was how at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, there are some really amazing, I give you full credit for this term, these pockets of heroic effort, which I think will resonate with anyone who's doing work in the accessibility field in any kind of organization, that there are really good practices happening in parts of the university. And I think some of the ones that had come up at UMass were around UDL, instructional design, and some other areas, that the Assistive Technology Center, some really good resources and practices, but siloed and not scaled because they are siloed in departments. And even some departments, I think, that may have been a little ahead of others in terms of academic departments, in terms of their approach to inclusion and accessibility. I know that since we last worked together and during these last several months, this accelerated accessibility period, that you've done some work on greater collaboration and coordination. Can you talk a little bit about that, including maybe some description of what it felt like before taking some improving steps?
Sure. I mean, for those of you who've spent time, and this is true of both large and small higher education, but higher education tends to be a very siloing structure, at least in my experience. There's a couple of exceptions, but there tends to be a lot of belief that faculty are experts in their domain. And by virtue of experts in the domain, there's a lot of notion of self-rule and self-governance, and that sometimes extends out to administration. I'll avoid opining too deeply on that, but there are some challenges that come from that. There's communication, there's logistical challenges, and what you end up seeing is sort of subcultural development about this is important. And what I've observed, and I've seen this both in technology fields as well as accessibility, is, and let me take it out of the accessibility domain, my email team for many years thought they delivered the best email application out there. They understood how it worked. Nobody else understood how it worked, but it made a lot of sense to them, and they thought they were doing great. And so within their minds, they were providing heroic effort, but the impact from a user perspective was not the heroic effort they thought it was going to be. And so I've observed similar challenges within accessibility at the campus as well, is there are these pockets of brilliance, these pockets of heroes that are out there working with good empathy. The challenge is they don't always have, or they have not been provided the degree of leadership to have these conversations more broadly. Like, so why is it that one of the very small questions that came up had to do with a resource allocation around providing captioning for course materials for students that had defined accessibilities, and it became defined accommodations, and it became this substantial issue that the costs were decentralized out to each of the departments. And many of our departments, by virtue of being academic, tend to run on very thin budgets. And so when we stopped this conversation as we went into the pandemic and said, what is the net budget impact here? And, you know, I can't remember what the number was, but let's say it was of order $40,000 across the campus. You know, when I brought it up to the right degrees of leadership, they're like, we're arguing over this. Like, it's a $1.3 billion budget. And don't get me wrong, $40,000 is real money, but that's not the thing we should be arguing. But by virtue of us decentralizing decision-making to that being 40 decisions of $1,000 each, it became much more difficult to get the resource allocation. So the key observation I'd say is clearly articulating why this is important, clearly articulating that when we marshal our resources collectively, we can make changes that don't seem so big when you're working in a larger context. And it really involves that collaboration between and amongst groups. And I've actually been very pleased. I think going through the review with G3 ICT certainly delivered us a roadmap. It certainly delivered us a maturity model. It gave us a sense of where we sat, but it actually opened up conversations amongst teams that have worked and sat together for many, many years, but those conversations weren't as effective. You know, we always joke, my background, like I said, is information security with auditors. If the audit doesn't tell you what you want to know, you did something wrong, right? I will say I've been very pleased with James, had a very objective, and the team he brought in was excellent. But it told us what we wanted to hear, is that you've got some pockets of brilliance, but there's some coordination, there's some logistics of an alignment you need to do. Having a third party assert that brought more credibility to this notion of accessibility than any empathetic call from staff on campus could have.
Thank you for that, Chris. And I think to your credits, and we've done a good number of these reviews of universities and of smart cities as well. I think one of the things that you did that was pretty courageous, I think, is you involved an enormous number of people from both the academic side of the university and the administrative side in a large number of conversations. I think over these 10 conversations that our expert team had with your university community, there were 200 participants, 40 unique individuals, I think, but they were heavily attended. Some of these discussions were quite passionate, I will say, because the passion was there. Can you talk a little bit about where recognizing and wanting to make even more progress on collaboration and breaking down some of these silos and amplifying some of these heroic efforts, either where some of these, what are some of these pockets that you would love to see replicated? And I'd also be curious to hear a little bit about what are some of the groups that can help promote this kind of collaboration? I know we had talked in particular in our conversations with UMass, the faculty senate actually had been pretty engaged on these issues of accessibility. There is an academic advisory committee, I think, on accessibility. Are there any sort of areas that or groups that can help you as the CIO promote this collaboration?
Yeah, that's a great question, James. One of the key things, and one of the things that I've found sort of helpful to me in my career, both in the CIO role I'm in previously in the information security role, is identifying those governance structures and where they have efficacy. And that's one of the things that I've observed, at least in some of the accessibility staff I've worked with. They have passion, they have technical focus, they have deep empathy and deep caring, but they don't have the experience with how universities govern themselves, or what the governance structures, or where decision authority really rests. It's great to think, I've had staff that think I have all sorts of decision authority. I have responsibility for my $30-odd million of budget, but that's sort of the extent of the responsibility I have. I have responsibility for standards. As we get into decision-making, I have to tie into bodies like our faculty senate. I have an information technology advisory council, some of these academic advisory councils. We have other both faculty and administration leadership groups, task force that are focused on the shared governance structure of universities. We have administrative focused units. So working with accessibility teams to identify where those power structures exist, how change occurs in an institution, and how you can be effective at making this case amongst all the many other cases. That was one of the key things, which again, I was fortunate to have had a lot of this experience in information security. I'd observed many of my peers in information security at other institutions come in and try to win the day of information security solely on technical merit. Like, well, we're going to go to this, we're going to spend another $100,000 on this new antivirus thing because it's incrementally better than this other thing. And quite honestly, when you're making that case to a CFO or to a chancellor or a provost, that's $100,000 for a technical thing I don't understand. Whereas if you can turn it into a conversation about either mitigating institutional risk, delivering institutional benefit, and understanding how change actually occurs to the campus, when you make that case in business terms, it becomes more rational and plausible amongst the 1,000 other things the provost or the chancellor or the CFO has been asked in the last day. So that's the key transition for me, is how do you find those power structures? How do you identify those governance structures? And how do you make it a business value proposition, not solely a technical or empathetic proposition?
That's actually a perfect segue, Chris, into a topic that I know you feel passionately about, and that we recognize as well in our assessment tool. The maturity model is really pretty critical to an increase in commitment and capability on accessibility inclusion, and that is what we call the business case for accessibility. Moving beyond, particularly here in the United States, every university has a legal requirement to be accessible and inclusive. In other countries as well, but where you and I are sitting or standing here in the US today. But we'd like to sort of move the conversation beyond risk avoidance and legal compliance to what is the business case, or as you said, the why or the value proposition of accessibility. Based on your experience, either over the past year as a result of or as part of this assessment, or just in general, can you talk a little bit more about that key issue of how you are trying to tap into the why and the value proposition at UMass?
Absolutely. So one of the key value conversations we have on a regular basis, and this is not a conversation unique to UMass, it's not a conversation even unique to the Northeastern United States, but within the United States, there is a significant decline coming in college-age students in the coming years based off of just changes in birth rates and patterns like that. And what you're seeing is increasing competition within the field for high qualified students. You've seen this manifest through UMass was deeply involved in the closure of Mount Ida. We actually took over parts of those campus. We inherited some of the students from there. Recently, I know Becker College in Worcester announced that it is intending to close as well. One of the key things that drives university budgets is attracting and retaining strong students to maintain competitiveness. And if the population is shrinking, one way from a business value perspective is to make sure that you're delivering a natively accessible education to appeal to as broad a population of students as possible. If we are, by virtue of not providing accessible content, unintentionally excluding some arbitrary percentage, say even 5% or 10% of our students, that's 10% of a student population that will not become paying students, high quality students. We're excluding a portion of our population that could engage. And that's based on a conjecture of 10%. If the conjecture is much higher, we could be unintentionally avoiding potential population when we know there's going to be restrictions in that. So from a very raw perspective, if budgets are driven at institutions through a combination of both undergraduate, graduate tuition, and research education, if we are not strongly positioned meeting the market demand, and that can either be meeting market demand because there's a growth, or being more competitive and approachable to a larger population if there's a reduction in that potential student population, we are not tied into the strategic mission of the institution to provide our role as a land grant, to provide instruction to residents of the Commonwealth, and to create a workforce for the Commonwealth. We have over 250,000 living alumni from UMass. A vast majority of them stay in Massachusetts. At UMass, we graduate more students than the top 8 private institutions from the state of Massachusetts combined. That means we're tied deeply to the workforce. And so if we cannot find a way to make our content accessible and approach that, we're not only risking our own potential economic future, but we're actually risking issues of workforce development and long-term competitiveness of the state potentially.
Yeah, how a couple things in there that I'd love to follow up on. One is you've talked about the role of students and the diversity of students as a driver for competitiveness of UMass and fulfilling your many roles as a land grant state university. As you're thinking about the why and the value proposition, are you having discussions or thinking about, and we certainly discussed this as part of our engagement, the technology assets you're deploying, the accessibility of them, it also impacts faculty and staff. Is that part of the calculus as well?
It absolutely is, because again, if that same rubric holds, is as we remain a competitive institution, we have to be competitive in our hiring practices. And that means approaching as broad a population of the available talent pool out there. If we are not delivering natively accessible experiences, whether that is directly instructional or it's as pedantic as HR forms, right? Everybody's got to do an HR form somewhere. But if we're delivering, and we've had our challenges as an institution of 3-copy carbon forms that our Vice Chancellor of Human Resources loves to say he got rid of the last typewriter not that many years ago, right? There's clearly some substantial issues that we've had. If we are not competitive with a potential workforce, both at the highly skilled faculty level, at the highly skilled technical level, but at all levels of the organization, we're going to potentially compromise the available resource pool as well. So again, if it comes back to business case, I see a compelling business case to make sure accessibility is core to our digital transformation because it allows our long-term access to a larger candidate pool. With the move to remote work, we're having very serious conversations of what does that mean long-term? Right? We've had staff working remotely. We're going to struggle like every other public and private institution is now. What does it mean for workforces returning if the pandemic slows as we're hoping? Would we accept this notion of more broad remote work? Does that increase our potential labor pool? Those are all interesting questions that are going to have to be worked out. But if we cannot position our institution to be natively digitally inclusive, we're excluding a portion of our population that may have accessibility accommodations that we're just turning our back to from the get-go. And that's a challenge. That's a loss both to us, and it's a loss of potentially high talented, high skill individuals that could make this university stronger.
So Chris, I would imagine that with your expertise and experience in the information security space, you've sort of tackled this issue of the value proposition, the why of security. How is the starting conversations, advancing conversations about the business case, the why and the value proposition of accessibility, how's that being received? Where is it being received well? Where is it a bit more of a struggle?
I'd say it's being received well at the high level when I talk about this notion of making sure we're finding the most accessible pool. We're ensuring we're going to remain competitive, tying to workforce. So I think the value proposition at executive level is very strong there. We've always been very successful at the value proposition at a very operational level for our students and our staff that are providing accessibility accommodations, who are working with students on a one-on-one basis, for our help desk who are taking calls. Where the challenge is, and I think we've had a path to move forward, is for people who do not have either the high level strategy or do not have the day-to-day blocking and tackling, is trying to make the value proposition of why is this one more thing they should do? Why should you take 10 more minutes to ensure accessibility, alt image tags? Why should you take 2 more minutes to turn on the captioning features in Zoom or PowerPoint? So I ended up teaching again this fall. I taught for many years at UMass. I took a number of years off. When I taught this fall, I taught entirely remotely. I taught entirely by Zoom. Zoom's native captioning feature wasn't there. So I elected to use PowerPoint, use Office 365, and turn on the captioning when I lectured. I used Zoom to record the lecture, and it put the captions into it. It's not perfect. It wasn't great. But the cost to me was thinking to do it, clicking a checkbox on Office 365 on PowerPoint, and making sure I hit play and record. So the incremental burden to me of applying captioning to course content, and I've taught this course material for 20 years. This is the first year I did that. So there was 2 minutes of clicking. It took me about 10 minutes going through each of my slide decks to apply alt image tags. That investment of my time as an instructor is absolutely worth it to make sure that content is more accessible. And that's the value proposition. I think we have to hit that middle portion of the population that has impact. It maybe is not core to their day-to-day, but if we can move that population, the impact is going to be tremendous.
I love that example. And we actually discussed this as part of the remote site visit as well, of a part of the value proposition and a part of these. We had quite a bit of discussion about budgets and resources and funding. But in these roadmaps that we deliver, including the one to UMass, we list quick wins, relatively simple things that a university can do to make some good advancement on accessibility. One of them is maximizing the use of the accessibility functionality that you already have and may not know about, and deploying that. And congratulations to you. I love hearing that example. Before we move on to the last topic, which is leadership, just on this issue of value prop and budgets and resources, you mentioned earlier on in this discussion that as your role in supporting the university's public health responsibilities increased and shifting resources to think about that in your department. I know you've also made some changes, I think, around accessibility as well, with some new accessibility staff, maybe, which I assume was driven in part by these issues of the why and the value proposition. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and I would be remiss if I didn't point something else. By the way, if you can hire yourself a brilliant chief of staff who actually gets this stuff done, it makes it a lot easier. So Karen Howard wasn't able to join us today. Karen is chief of staff on my team. She was James's counterpart working through this evaluation. Karen's brilliant, she's focused, she's motivated, but she provided an empathetic project resource that got the why proposition and then drove it to completion. So if there is a resource here, definitely having that project level resource that knows how to do it. Karen can do pretty much anything, but it was really her project diligence, her follow through that carried it forward. So specifically to answer the question that James asked, is what we did is we actually had some staff transitions that occurred just through sort of normal staff transitions. So we've actually been able to fund new positions, and we've moved them under Karen in her new role. So she'll be actually taking on, in addition to her chief of staff role, responsibility for the accessibility team on my IT team. what we found is through staff transitions, as we had a couple of staff leave for family and personal reasons, we found that there were skill sets within our existing staff that had focus, had passion, had motivation, maybe didn't have the formal training. So we really tried to tie into that because those individuals understood the campus culture. They knew how. One of the folks was from a web development background, had done accessibility reviews. And so really we've pivoted to focusing on that in-source staffing, growing staffing modestly, but really supplementing it with student staff. Again, we have this, it's one of the things that's brilliant about having 25,000 undergraduates, especially when we're all on campuses. That's a huge labor pool that's often looking for work. They're focused, they're motivated, they're passionate. So we're really trying to continue to grow on that. So it's not just at the continue to hire O1 employees, get base funded employees, which can be a heavy lift, but supplement that. The other piece we're doing is also trying to push that content and those practices out more broadly to the colleges, closer to a lot of the faculty and students. So that's going to be an ongoing work. We're early in our roadmap, and certainly the content from G3 ICT has been helpful in us identifying how can we relatively prioritize investments, either monetary or time investments, in order to make improvements to our accessibility posture and our digital inclusion posture.
Fantastic, and Karen is exceptional. And I always am really happy to hear examples of how a smart university or a smart city are using the business case, using the value proposition to expand FTE that are focused on accessibility and digital inclusion. So congratulations to you for that, and for doing that in the middle of a pandemic as well, when I know your responsibilities were dramatically increased for your roles, which actually is a nice segue into the last topic of conversation for us today, leadership. A big part of our maturity model assessment tool, and a big part of the conversations we have with universities that we're using with is around leadership, senior executive sponsorship. Are the leadership at the university, are they knowledgeable about disability and accessibility? Are they engaged? Are they making public commitments to accessibility in their faculty, staff, students with disabilities? So it'd be great to hear you talk a little bit about beyond you as a leader, and certainly in the roadmap we call that out, the things that you were doing and wanted to be doing were demonstrated exceptional leadership as the CIO of the university, but maybe some talk a little bit about how the leadership plays a role at UMass Amherst in this journey that you're working on around accessibility, greater accessibility and inclusion.
Sure. So for me, a lot of that is, again, tying into what those power structures and where the conversations are being driven. So in my role as CIO, I have the mechanism to add agenda items to the leadership conversation. I can put items on the meeting amongst the provost and the chancellor and others. So I'm really trying to use my role as a facilitator to make this a relevant topic. And so we've done this in other key areas. The chancellor recently added about a couple of years ago, an assistant chancellor for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So she's been a tremendous partner, right? This notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion has historically not included accessibility. It's been much more about racial, gender diversity, but there's a tight alignment. That notion of inclusion is very broad. So building very logical partnership there. So between me and the associate chancellor for DEI, we can help carry messages forward. Again, when I look at the responsibilities of a provost or a chancellor, the provost and I have joked with each other, like, he doesn't want my job, I don't want his job, right? He does well on his, I do well on mine. It's a challenge having to lead 1,500 faculty. And so you have to make that relevant. At the same time, you have all the day-to-day issues of a significant budget, a competitive and hiring environment. So I'd say we haven't crossed the point of making very broad-based leadership statements that we are going to make this as a core focus. What we have focused on is making this notion of inclusion, this notion of engaging a broad population key to that. And we're tying these notions of accessibility into that broader inclusion rubric. My team can focus on digital inclusiveness, which means that we're delivering applications natively digitally inclusive, that we're not thinking of accessibility as an add-on or a bolt-on or an after the fact, or, oh, we'll call a captioner. No offense to the captioner, but right, I want this even lower bar. I want to make sure that we can engage individuals so that where there's use cases where there may not be the resources to get dedicated staff to provide that, we can use the native tools, whether it's the Microsoft tools or the Google tools. We've actually been fairly impressed. We just, at the start of this semester, we turned on the captioning feature in Zoom that finally they delivered it in their general availability release. I continue to be impressed, and it's not a replacement for captioning, but it's a supplement. It's a low-cost supplement. It adds a lot of value. So raising those conversations in place, and I know there's challenges with accuracy rates, but it helps. And if I can't find a way to solve the issue perfectly, I have to find a way to solve the issues and the resources available. making steps with a mind towards digital inclusion to lower that barrier to entry, to make our content, to make our accessibility a native part of our operation is going to be key. So the leadership, I think, is an ongoing journey. I've been pleased with the reception, the positivity, but I've got to be fair, it's not top of mind right now. Top of mind is, how do we get back to normal operations? How do you deal with issues of vaccination? How do you get to a highly dense campus? We are a natively residential campus. Those are the conversations that are dominating leadership conversations today, as appropriately they should. Bringing the accessibility conversations along as part of that will continue to occur. And I think as we get back to normalcy, it'll take more and more relevance.
Sure. I think that point about the uniqueness of this time for universities is well taken by everyone. And you have talked about how the provost has, working with the provost, you've gotten some new investments in accessibility. I think one of the really interesting parts of the conversation that we had as part of the maturity model assessment on leadership was around these other pockets of or areas of potential leadership, which I think were quite interesting and somewhat unique in some ways, I think, at UMass. Certainly, I had mentioned the Faculty Senate, which had adopted some resolutions specifically on accessibility, which, I think could help drive up a commitment and capability on accessibility. But at the time, I believe there was a new students with disabilities group, I think, and also maybe even a new employees resource group, employees with disabilities resource group. Are there other kinds of looking beyond the sort of typical senior executives where you would expect to be cultivating leadership support? Are there other places where you see opportunities to exertly get leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, while I've always been a fan, you should be able to lead from the front. I've seen true cultural change and true organizational change take off when leadership occurs at all levels of the organization. That can occur at my most junior staff member, that can include undergraduate students and undergraduate student leadership. We've seen definite increases in the engagement with that. We've had students working on wayfinding applications. We've had engagement between, we're fortunate to have a wonderful college of education that has domain expertise and accessibility. They provide consultation to K-12. So we've been trying to tie their expertise into some of our both faculty senate leadership teams, as well as some of our operational teams, to make sure that voice is out there. If you have expert resources and the price is right, as they say, right, we should be leveraging that effectively, because it also ties to research objectives that they have in their role. So the pivot I think I'm seeing at this point is the leadership position at the front stays strong, but the real change is going to occur lower in the organization, where leadership is taken at whatever level you're at to focus it forward. And my job as a leader is to provide a fertile field to allow that cultivation to occur.
Fantastic. And as I mentioned, it was really fantastic that you pulled in so many people from across the university as part of this assessment process. Really unique and I think hopefully powerful for you. Chris, we are at the end of our hour, but maybe if there's any either last thoughts that you have or any quick tips or suggestions that you want to share with the audience, both here, but also this webinar will be archived for use by IAAP members.
No, I'd say the only thing is, I appreciate the work in this community to raise the relevance of this topic. It is relevant. There is explicit business value. But the key thing that drives it for me is it's the right thing to do, right? If something else, I can always fall back to when I'm having a conversation with faculty of when am I going to find the time to apply alt tags, or when am I going to find, it's the right thing to do. And I continue to remain impressed institutionally with our commitment to do the right thing. Digital inclusion is about doing the right thing. It's about making that content accessible to whomever, wherever, whenever. It ties to our strategic mission, it ties to our focus. And in many cases, it's fairly incremental, the effort investment. It takes a little bit of leadership and a little bit of stepping up and saying, yep, we're going to take some leadership on this. That cost is low, the return is high, and it's the right thing to do. So I applaud the work that G3ICT is doing in IAAP. And again, you'll have my support. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to where we go from here.
Chris, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure working with you, as it was over the course of the last year. Just as a heads up to the audience here, the next webinar in this series will actually be a similar conversation with a leader from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. That will be equally as interesting, I think, that conversation. And then the session after that will be, I mentioned that a part of this maturity model process is that we curate a team of experts to engage with the universities. We'll have a couple of those experts to talk about these quick wins that I mentioned, the kinds of easy things relatively easy things that a university can be doing, like Chris was talking about earlier, about turning on the accessibility functionality and making use of that. The kinds of quick wins that universities can be doing to make some really easy and almost immediate improvements in accessibility and inclusion at the university. So with that, again, thank you, Chris, so much. Congratulations on your great work. Good luck moving forward. And Rachel, I guess I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank our captionists for joining us, and we hope to see you all back in April for session 4.
James, Chris, that was excellent.
Look at that, on time and under budget.
And the audience was stayed on the whole time. It was a real, you made so many, Chris, you made so many good points. I mean, and I mean the value proposition, why statement, doing the right thing, the very end, the leadership. I mean, it just was woven. These points were woven throughout the presentation. I really appreciate it. This is
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Again, I appreciate it. And, you know, James and Julie have been a pleasure to work with. So it's great to be able to engage in the community a little bit.
Hey, Chris, have you met Christopher and vice versa? Or,
No, it's the first time.
No, we're working it out. So
Christopher runs the IAAP. He's a colleague of mine. Okay.
And I was at Georgia Tech and UGA for several years and ran a program called AMAC, which did a lot of the digital accessibility and founded it.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's some intersectionality. I know the guy, the CTO at Georgia Tech. I know pretty well. He's now the CIO up at Virginia. So yeah,
they move around.
They do.
You stay where you're at. You're doing a good job. We need you there.